Welcome to another edition of MYB Cast, a podcast devoted to educating our followers to alternatives for self-care and wellness through the somatic world of the mind-body connection. Today, we're featuring another episode of the series Portraits of the Pioneers. Portraits of the Pioneers is an in-depth look at those that have been actively involved in the exploration, the development, and the practice of somatic touch therapy. I'm Richard Mack, and I'm here with my co-host, Anna Marie Bowers, and today we're into episode 2 with Jack Blackburn. Jack, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Richard and
So,
Anna Marie.
Welcome back, Jack. We're gonna get
normally at this second episode, we usually get deeper into your relationship with clients, but in the break, we had a little discussion about guilt, and I'm wondering if guilt plays a role into
Oh,
why
you're gonna
you're doing
start with
what
that
you're
one.
doing.
Okay. Father, forgive me, for I have sinned. I just confessed to Richard for the first time that I worked on nuclear missiles when I was 19 years old, 19 to when I was 19, almost 21. Um, and so I'm trying to live that down. Uh,
I have a question for you, Jack, just to kind
yeah.
of bring us back around. What can you tell us a little bit about a client or two that maybe changed your practice?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Like
Well,
the
yeah,
flip. Yeah.
the first one I'll mention is a woman that a doctor friend of mine sent her to me because she had had hemorrhoid surgery and the stitches broke. And so it was like, it was torture for her to do anything with her rectum, but it was also torture for her to just be living her life. She was a artist. She was actually a professional artist and making good money doing that. But anyway, so he sent her to me and he said, well, you're doing a lot of movement with the body, so that you can probably help her circulation and help heal the pain and the wound. Well, her name was Margaret, and I have written about her because she changed my whole understanding of pain. The first session I worked on her, when I got to her rectum, I don't work on the rectum, and so I gave her Reiki at energy work and therapeutic touch in that area of her body. And I asked her to come into that area and tell me what she was feeling. And she said, I feel like there's burning hot coals in my rectum. And I said, and I don't even know where this came from, but I said, well, can you make it hotter? And she could. And I said, can you make it colder? And she could. And I gave her an assignment because she was an artist. I said, when you go home, I want you to practice that so that you're having some feeling of control over what's going on there. And then I would like you to draw your pain. And she did that. And she came back the next time and she showed me the drawings and she said, "Yeah, I'm able to turn it up and turn it down, but it is agony. I'm suicidal." And so we worked that session. I think we did one or two more sessions the same way, but she was getting used to coming to me and talking about what she was experiencing while she was experiencing it. And then the next time she came, she said, I'm hearing all this poetry inside. And I said, so why don't you write it down and bring it to the session? She did that, and I asked her if she'd be willing to read the poetry to me that she had written down. She did that. Uh, the other thing that happened, oh, I know, I want to say one other thing. She was very, very angry at the doctor that did the surgery because she remembered that before, as she was coming out of anesthesia, she heard him say, "I think I tied the stitches too tight." And when she called him, uh, I think it was like the next day, she called him. He said, "No, I never said that at all." And she said, "Well, the stitches are broken." He said, "Well, we need to do it again."
Oh,
There was no way she was going to go back and do that again. So that's another very important piece. Anyway, she started reading this poetry to me, and I said, "Margaret, that's amazing." She said, "Well, I'm hearing it inside. I'm writing it down, and I'm hearing words I've never heard before, and so on and so forth." And then she realized that some of the words were familiar, and it was because when she was 18, she'd had a love affair with a very famous psychologist. And she recognized that she was hearing this poetry from him.
hmm,
And we both talked about him. I looked him up and learned much more about his work and so on. He was very famous. He was still alive. But anyway, so she was doing this poetry. Then all of a sudden her poetry started to change. I said, "Margaret, this seems very much like alchemy. You know what alchemy is?"
yes.
Okay. Well, it feels very much. She said, "What is alchemy?" And I said, "Well, these are guys that used metals and so on and so forth to try to create a new understanding of the matter around us and so on." And so she went home and she found a book on her shelf called Alchemy.
Alchemy, of course. Of
And
course you
it
did.
was, and the book was written by Maria von Franz, who is a very famous Jungian psychologist. And Margaret recognized Maria von Franz and the book because she had done an illustration for the book years ago when she was living in Switzerland with her husband, who was a conductor of the Swiss opera. And she went and she looked in the book and she found her illustration, which was towards the end of the book. And then she looked back towards the front of the book and she found another illustration that was almost exactly like hers. It was done by a very famous alchemist in the 15th century. His name was Jacob Boehm.
Hmm.
And she started realizing, wait a second, when I was married to the director of the Swiss Opera, my name was Jacoby. And she said, Jacob B.
Ah,
And she started to realize she did have a connection with alchemy, and that something besides doing the illustration from Maria von Franz. And she also realized that when during the off season of the opera, she and her husband would travel around Europe because he was looking for early manuscripts, music manuscripts. That was one of his things he did for his own enjoyment. And they went into this little town in Germany, and uh, Margaret could speak the language in that town.
mhm,
She could speak. She was from Australia.
mhm.
She didn't know any German at all. She could speak the language of that town. And then she found out that was the town that Jacob Boehm lived in his whole life.
Fascinating.
So so, so, so she actually was kind of living two lives. She was reviewing Jacob Boehm and she was living this other life. And when I started, she was married to somebody else when I started working with her. But this became fascinating. Also, she became very fascinated by the fact that she was having this experience of two lives, and her whole conscious awareness was changing. Also, she recognized that pain had saved her life. She, um, I'll say one more thing. She had a dream uh, a little few days after we started working together, and this time it was a woman surgeon, and she removed a metal cross from Margaret's rectum. Okay, her
Interesting
father,
symbolism, yes.
yeah, and so then she realized that there's some connection with religion and what happened to me and this pain. She went to Australia and visited her father. He was still alive. Her father was a guy. He worked for the Anglican Church in Australia. He was a preacher, and he had a radio broadcast every week. And she realized that she had grown up in the cocoon of the religion because of her father.
Mhm.
Anyway, so long story short, Margaret and I kept working together for years and discovered many, many things about pain and about consciousness and awareness and so on and so forth. And she wrote a book called Singing Past Winter, which was Singing Past Winter, which was amazing, amazing book. She won a first author's book. It's full of poetry, basically. First author's book. She won an award, national award for the book, and somebody composed a symphony based on what was in that book. And they performed it in Seattle. Her husband was
Oh,
quite well to do, and so on and so forth. So this is Margaret, and uh, I talked to her, maybe 10 years after we had been working together. I wrote an introduction to her book. Uh, and I said, "Well, what are you doing now?" She said, "I'm writing an autobiography of Jacob Boehme."
awesome.
And she said, "Pain is my compass." She became very well known on radio and interviews and things like that. But so that's Margaret. The next client, who is the next client? Um, well, one of my clients who had Parkinson's disease was a very, very bright man. I knew him through his daughter, and normally he lived in San Francisco, but he was up in Washington State because of his daughter, and so I started working with him, and he told me his whole history of Parkinson's. And he said at some point they were using psychotropic drugs to work with Parkinson's. And he said that when he experienced that, he went into hell, totally into hell. He said that was the most horrible experience of my life. So anyway, um, his daughter she was involved in rebirthing, if you know what that is. That was also
That
trendy at the time.
that was a long time ago. You want to say a few words about for people who might not know what that is, just a sentence to
Yeah.
describe rebirthing?
Well, I'll describe my experience of going through rebirthing with her. She and another woman were I went into a hot tub and they took me underneath the water in the hot tub. And I actually did go through a rebirthing experience. I felt so high. I was not breathing. I felt so high. And then I heard them say, "Oh, God, we better get him out of here." So they pulled me up to the surface. Well, that's exactly what happened in my birth.
Mm-hmm.
I was a cesarean and I was really enjoying, but apparently the
Cord.
cord was around my neck.
Mhm.
And so I wasn't breathing, and I was having a great time down there, and then they pulled me out. But anyway, her father, with his Parkinson's, we became very good friends. Like I said, he called himself an autodidact. That means self-learning person. And he told me so many things that he had investigated and learned over the years, and we shared that back and forth. And I was working on his Parkinson's as I was working on him. And I helped him and his wife, who was Margaret's mother, get back together. And they did get back together, and they had this uh, wonderful merge emerging experience. But then his Parkinson's got worse. He was back in San Francisco, and um, and Margaret was glad that I had been in touch with her father and so on and so forth. But she was also reporting that he was not doing very well. Well, what happened is they gave him psychotropics again, and he died.
Mm.
He warned me about going to graduate school at a Catholic university, Richard. He said, those Catholics are going to eat you alive. And I reported back to him, and I said, no, I'm eating them alive.
These are
Yeah.
really, really incredible stories about the perfect examples of how the body and the mind work together. These are
Yes,
just, and serendipity and synchronicity and all of those things. I kind
exactly.
of I kind of want to hear a little bit about your experience because you're so focused on being in the now, in the present, and
Yeah.
you're extremely observant. My perception is that you are an extremely observant person. I don't think you probably miss anything that's going on around you. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about that experience that you and Richard had where you were working with him, working with a client by Zoom, because, we've gone through this pandemic time where we had to kind of do things in a different way. And
Yes.
it's
Yes.
not the same as, remote healing energy work. You were actually talking to him, as he was working. And so I'm
Uh,
just a little bit curious about how that was for both of you.
yeah. Well, I'm curious about how it was for Richard, but I'll tell you how it was for me.
Yeah.
So what Richard and I got to know one another. I recognized that he was working with another kind of body problem, that cerebral palsy, and he was working with very young children, and he was working with people who became athletes who had cerebral palsy, special athletics, and so on, Special Olympics, and I asked Richard, I think I'm putting it the right way, if he would like me to help him in his sessions. I wanted to observe what he was doing because I was quite impressed. Uh, Not only he had done movies of these uh, people he'd worked with that were showing that they were able to run and kick a ball and so on and so forth. And so anyway, I asked him if he would like me to become part of the sessions. And so we did that. And what was very interesting, because Richard was very focused on his work and on his clients that he'd worked on for some time. What was interesting is we were finding new ways together of helping them have feeling awareness in the parts of the body that had been affected by the stroke that they had when they were in utero. And I'll say one more thing about it. Richard was not very favorable to any kind of medical intervention, especially if it involves surgery on those children. And then I looked up, and Richard, I know you will remember this. They were doing surgery with the patella, so that because if the patella is not aligned with the upper leg and the lower leg, the person can lose all of a sudden and collapse, especially going downstairs or riding a bike or whatever. Well, anyway, I looked it up online and I realized the surgery that they were doing was just amazing. They were reconnecting some of the tendons so the patella would stay in alignment with the upper and lower leg so that they wouldn't have that collapse thing. So I reported that to Richard, and it was wonderful because it was kind of like, okay, so yeah, maybe surgery isn't so bad. And anyway, so go ahead, Richard.
We actually have that some of that research that you did on that because I remember distinctively when we were working with that young lad and you know I was so honored to be part and still am part of the CP soccer world and Levi was one of the co-founders. It was actually him that his father who basically got behind this whole idea that look, there's no place for these kids to go. We need to create a place and we were part of that and still are part of that. And that's actually grown globally now. They're all over the world, CP soccer. And that little segment of the video of that operation when we were putting together, we did when I was in the Sorbonne doing the presentation at the Movement and Cognition conference, and we did it on the CP athletes. I actually showed that, and I did it inside an edited video of Levi in different stages, and my editor just like called me up and says, I quit. I can't work with stuff like this. It was so graphic. That operation was just so graphic. Everybody's got a body. That's what it looks like under the skin.
Yeah,
What
yeah.
was it like, Richard, working with a client where you're actually touching the client and getting feedback from someone who was remote and how who's clearly sensing somehow what's going on in the room where you are? What was that experience like? I'm sorry, I put you on the spot here.
No, I don't mind answering that one at all. Well, first and foremost, you mentioned something about Jack's ability to be perceptive. Well, I would totally agree with that. You know,
Mhm.
here I have my little Mac Top Pro sitting on a stool next to me working, and you know, as long as I had it on the right angle, you know, Jack was saying, "Okay, go here, go there, go this, try this." Jack introduced me into compression work, starting with the foot, going into the patella, going into the hip, going into the wrist, going that work opened up so many people. I can't even begin to tell you. But to answer your question specifically, I think Jack's perception, not only being in the moment and being presenting, he actually was connecting with those people that were on my table. Jack is in Tokyo, Japan, and we're in New Jersey and we're having this session. It's like 4 o'clock in the morning for Jack. And, you know, it's just like, okay, let's just do this. And I mean, I just saw Nishan just recently the other day, and he's asking for you, Jack. He says, "How is Jack?"
Oh,
Yeah, we did a
I'd love
lot
to
of
see
work with
him again.
Nishan. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. Why don't you bring him to Japan?
There you go.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I did a series of classes in Switzerland, and we flew an airline that was what's that country in the Middle East that's now with the really tall buildings and stuff?
Dubai.
Qatar.
Shakar? Okay, Shakar. Okay.
Qatar. Okay, I
Yeah.
flew Qatar Airlines, and then when we got on the plane, I realized the reason it was so cheap, the flight, was because it was full of Special Olympics athletes, including some of the people I'd seen in movies performing before they were going to go to the Olympics, and including a woman that was only about 3 feet tall, and so on and so forth. So I was surrounded by these special athletes, and then there was this really tall Egyptian guy. I said, "I know what you do. You do volleyball."
Mhm.
And anyway, we had a really good time on the flight. Koito and I did it together, and then we had a really good time in Switzerland. Once again, working with all different kinds of people. So yeah. Anyway, but Richard, I just it was a great experience doing that together. And I realized that he and Madelana they had done so much original work
Mhm.
with these CP clients. And I mean, that's the book I'm waiting for from Richard and Madelana, is
Oh,
that
there's a
because it,
good challenge.
and for body workers to understand that you can be incredibly creative in how you work with the special condition clients. So,
Absolutely, absolutely. I've worked with a paralysis client. She was partially paralyzed on half of her body was paralyzed and the other half was not.
mhm.
And learning as I'm going, discovering what works and what doesn't, and learning that you can actually work on the part of the body that's not paralyzed and then repeat that exact same thing on the other side that's paralyzed, and you will get a response, a neurological response.
Yeah,
It's just continuing to stimulate the left and the right brain back to back to back to back, and
yeah.
it's just like charging up a battery, and began to have responses like that. But I was really curious about that remote experience because that's a different kind of way of working with touch.
Mm.
Well, and it also opened up doors in terms of our classes because I realized that what was going on with COVID and so on, I couldn't fly back and forth to the United States or Europe, and so we had to start teaching uh, online classes, webinars, and
Right.
that was and getting used to cameras and microphones and so on, which Richard had to get used to too.
Yes. It's an adjustment. It's an
It
adjustment.
it is, and in some ways, I will say one thing about it, uh, and that is when you're doing a webinar, the people who are participating in the webinar have more freedom of their own thoughts and their own awareness because in a live class, everyone's watching the instructor and the instructor is going around and doing this, that, and the other thing. But in a webinar, it becomes a real andragogy. Andragogy is adult learning because everybody is participating. And if
Hmm.
they have a client on the table, they're giving feedback from what's they're happening from the client and so on and so forth. But they have also their own thoughts about what we're doing together. And I've learned to really love that experience. You know, so I like it in ways, and Richard really introduced me to this. I like it in many ways better than live classes because
It
live
creates a
classes, everyone's trying to copy me. And in those classes, they're not trying to copy me. Yeah.
sure, sure.
Yeah.
Creates a different field for the group.
Yes, it does. Very
Yeah.
much so.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
I
yeah.
wanted to come back to one thing that we all, as Traeger practitioners and massage therapists and body workers, a phrase that we often use, and I hear you say it often, Jack, you invited someone to come into their pain. You invited someone to come into their body at this
Mhm.
particular point or place. For
Mhm.
somebody who really doesn't understand our jargon, how would you kind of explain what it is you're asking the client to do?
Well, what I'm asking the client to do is, I'll put it in simple language, get out of their head and get into their body,
Mm-hmm.
because the body is totally different than the head. The head, our egos took over our head thousands of years ago. And we've been doing that ever since. That's why we fight wars. Why we're willing to destroy everything because my ego wants to win over your ego, that kind of thing. And so to teach them how to come into their body, there's three ways that's very, very easy to learn to come into their body. The first one is to breathe into that part of the body and fill that part with their breath and empty it with their out breath, filling and emptying. And I can feel with my hands when they're filling and emptying that part of the body. And so it works. So there's a two-way exchange. The second way is for them to come in and touch my hands directly. I had no idea that somebody could actually consciously do that. And it doesn't matter if I'm on the surface of the body or if I'm in deep inside the abdomen or wherever it is, that they can actually reach into that place in their body and touch my hands from that place. Because we have touch sensors in every part of our body. So touch is the second way. The third way is verbally. A client, if a client starts to describe what it feels like and how big it is, and can you go directly into that area of pain and describe it to me as you go inside? And they will describe it tactily, what it feels like. And as they start to do that, their whole relationship with that part of the body is changing. Yeah. So it's not
Isn't
that
that
the
an
pain,
interesting, yes, it's an
yeah,
interesting dynamic there that happens. Mhm.
yeah. And it's not that the pain goes away. So often it does because it's leftover pain from something that happened and the body's already repaired itself. But when the pain doesn't go away, the person is changing their relationship with the pain. It's no longer torture.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I worked with a man, Dr. Paul Brand, who wrote a book called Pain, the Gift That Nobody Wants. And I and a doctor friend of mine who has also had done whole lot of work with pain, we interviewed Paul Brand, and it totally changed the way we understood pain. Because he says basically in the United States, everyone's trying to get rid of pain. So they're taking pills and they're doing various other things to get rid of pain. What they don't realize is that the pain is actually a teacher.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
And it's, once again, it's always now. That is what is so significant.
Mhm.
It's always in the present moment. So,
Mm. Mm. And as we're about to close up this particular episode, I do want to go into one other point, and that is, the fact is, when you're working, the work that we do as body workers is quite unique. And as Jack mentioned earlier on, that doctors don't touch bodies anymore. I mean, we're the only ones
right.
that really do. Even physical therapists are not really doing much touch on their patients. And Jack always encouraged me to develop a network of medical workers, people that he says you'll find them. You'll find doctors and physical therapists and chiropractors and so forth that'll actually believe in what you're doing. And it's through that network that you start really opening up an alternative to what's currently being offered out there. And I think that's really good advice for all the therapists that are watching this right now is that to Jack's point, I mean, I was very much against surgery, but you know what? It has its place, and you got to respect that. As we do, we have our place, and that's really what we're trying to do here. We're trying to help people. At the end of the day, we have certain skill sets, and with certain understandings about how to use those skill sets, we're changing people's lives. So,
Yeah.
thank
Well, I
you.
really recommend to both of you that you read Paul Brown's book. It's now called The Gift of Pain, and it's only like $13 online. They'll send it to you. But because he grew up in India, where, pain is an accepted part of life, much more than it is in the United States. But he worked with lepers, with leprosy. And what he discovered is the reason that lepers' bodies deteriorated is because they don't feel pain. And so they
Ah,
keep doing the same thing over and over again, that's actually harming their body, but they don't feel it. They're sitting too close to the stove. They're, working in the fields and doing the same movement over and over and over again. And they're losing their fingers, they're losing their parts of their face, and so on and so forth. And they've always been in the Bible, they're cursed.
mm-hmm.
St. Francis was appalled by leprosy. he was afraid to touch a leper or even get near to a leper. It's been such a strong thing that God has punished these people. Well, Dr. Brand solved the whole problem by teaching them how to protect themselves, even if they can't feel the pain. And he did tremendous surgery on their hands and so on and so forth. Just amazing. So I recommend very much for everybody who's listening to this, read The Gift of Pain. It'll change, and especially in the United States, because we are totally weird about pain. Yeah. So
Well, Jack, thank you very much. That was an interesting episode. We talked about everything here from nuclear weapons to crosses to pain. So it's like, thank you again, Jack. I'll invite our audiences to join us again. We have one more episode of Jack coming up in which Jack's going to share with us some of the things he's doing. So until then, be well. Thank you.